Hello, everyone, and welcome to this off-site episode of The Citizen. Today, we're here in Professor Stephen Nuño-Perez's office here on NAU campus. Thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And really what we're here to talk about are these polls that you have released just within the last week.
Yeah.
But I want to start with this event you went to on Friday. Can you talk about the experience? You were there seeing President Joe Biden formally apologize for federal boarding schools.
Yeah, you know, it was a really somber experience to go there and to see the President of the United States on a reservation apologizing and acknowledging the history of our treatment. It's something I never really thought about until I moved to Flagstaff, where you have reservations near here, and you start to kind of think about the treatment of these folks. Then you start to have friendships and work relationships with people whose parents or them themselves at my age, right, were in these schools, and pretty horrible experience. And for the government to acknowledge that it felt somewhat celebratory for them. I got a celebratory, vibe. Also, kind of like a very somber. Deb Haaland was there and talked about it, and she was emotional and cried about it. Just to think about all these folks and how they were treated, and so I had a lot of mixed emotions about it.
Yeah, and we had the honor of interviewing Deb Haaland a couple weeks ago, and she's such, she means business, and to really see her on there, brought to tears. Yeah, that means a lot.
Yeah, having public service is interesting when you appoint folks who were directly affected by a lot of the things that they're now in charge of, right? So like Deb Haaland being in charge of Interior, and being able to advocate for a commission to investigate this and issue reports to the president that holds him accountable for that, right? I mean, you can't have these commissions, a lot of times, and you put your soul into that because it's directly affecting you and you want to do justice for your community. It gives you an opportunity to do that. So I think Deb Haaland's a really good example of how your experiences can really influence, civic participation, but also public service.
Right. And civic participation, that's exactly why we want you in this interview today. And so can you talk about what you uncovered in the polls? Yeah,
so it was interesting. We did the poll. It's a survey of Native American likely voters, and we wanted to do this survey to release results during the event, the apology. Largely, in my mind and in our donors' mind, was to begin or continue or use this time to acknowledge the voices of people who will be participating in our democracy, in the sense that they're going to be voting. And I think having research and data on this in this particular way allows us to communicate to the system, to the people who are running for office, that in a language that they understand, right? Like, this is what Native Americans think about these issues. Here's what they think. Here's how they might be voting, or how they say they're going to vote. Here's their attitudes towards these other issues like Prop 139 and abortion, right? And so it I hope becomes a tool to help translate. In many ways, we can't have conversations because of cultural divides, because of institutional divides, and so I hope the survey helps to bridge a lot of that with leaders and folks who don't necessarily understand how to communicate, right? So a lot of times, a lot of people will, with very good intentions, want to advocate and communicate with that community, but because of the segregation and the historical relationships, there's lots of trust issues, and
right.
All those things are barriers. And so I think there's just one little part to helping to bridge that gap.
Right. And so before we talk about, like the shown successes of your polling, there were some polls that said people just don't care. And that seems to tie into this mistrust of the federal government. And do you think that Friday's event will be successful in mending that?
I think it's an opportunity to begin mending, right? It's an opportunity to have conversations about what happened, what we did, our own participation in that as citizens, as people who maybe ignore it. And, we have these, and I think it also reminds us of the potential, right? Is for further, right, injustice. And, we have these conversations today about mass deportations and, we have during the backdrop of this election, right? There's a lot of demonizing of immigrants, of LGBTQ folks, right? Of trans folks, right? People who are largely on the sorts of boundaries of legitimacy in society, of which Native Americans, felt that for a very long time, right? And removing them from their families, putting them in schools essentially to erase their culture, is in large part the potential, right? And it's not like it's theoretical, right? It's like people are literally saying that they're going to do this, right? Like, we want to win this election so that we can deport people, so that we can cleanse our society, right? So that we can, and people in power, right, have been asked, well, does this mean you're going to separate children from their families? And the answer to that is like, oh no, we would never separate children from their families. We're going to deport the whole family, right? So like, there's this sense of what they're talking about, right, is not citizenship and rights. They're talking about legitimacy, right? Like, this is not, even though you're a citizen like Native Americans, right, you're not a legitimate human being, right? And so the conversations that we're having today, in a very normalized way, right? We're like, oh, well, there's both sides. There's, but one side is literally talking about, regardless of, we talk about Haitian immigrants in this conversation we had a couple months ago, right? Where one of the candidates is saying, well, yeah, it's true. These Haitian immigrants are here legally because the vice president, changed some laws, but that doesn't make them legitimately here, right? And we forget that, like, this is how Donald Trump's wife got here, right? She may have been here legally, but it was a lot of because of who she knew, and Donald Trump's wife's parents came here, right, and got citizenship in the same way, right? But like, they're out of that conversation. Right. So what we're largely talking about here with Native Americans is a lesson in the capacity of this country, and the trauma that we can inflict and will inflict, right, on communities simply because they're not seen as legitimate.
Okay, so I want to touch on something you just said. Because you studied, in this poll, you studied the indigenous vote here in Arizona. Yeah. But that's not your main focal research point. You study the trends of Latino voters. Right. And there's a clip going around of Trump's rally in Madison Square Garden.
There's a lot going on. Like, I don't know if you guys know this, but there's literally a floating island of garbage in the middle of the ocean right now. Yeah. I think it's called Puerto Rico.
So how is that kind of, how does that affect a key voting demographic for Republicans?
I think a lot of people think like, well, this is really going to damage Trump with Latino voters. But I keep emphasizing, or the flip side of that, right, is a lot of times this is a feature, not a flaw, right? We again tend to ignore how much. I mean, when we talk about Native Americans, right, the genocide didn't happen by itself, right? Yeah. Something had to have created this, and we needed a society to, at the very least, ignore it.
Right.
Right. And so we do have the capacity. It's largely it's in our blood, right? And so when folks say this about Puerto Rico, right, about Mexicans, about Latinos in general, it's tapping into a very real sentiment and historical emotion in this country that can mobilize people, right? And so I fear, right, less so that this might, damage, Latinos' views of Trump or whatever, but like really my concern is that this language is going to mobilize people. Like the intent, right, is to offend. The intent is to speak to these folks and to tell them that they are garbage, right? Like that makes me even more adamantly going to vote for Trump, right? Like that's, right. I think that's more likely the intention of this language. It's not to like, oh, we have to, and even the response from like JD Vance was like, people just need to get a sense of humor. Like, what's the problem? But if you tell them, your pronouns are he, she, they're all of a sudden triggered by this. This is a major offense to their, to their well-being, to their religion, to their identity. But, having someone saying, call me this is what I prefer to be called, doesn't affect him, right? It doesn't affect anybody for someone to say, this is how I prefer to be called, right? In fact, I don't know if JD is his name, right? He's like, call me JD, right? And people call him JD. And no one's worse for that, right? But you somehow saying, or me somehow saying, call me he, him, or they, right? They are offended by that. They're triggered by that. That is to them, right? Like, oh, me making, jokes about your island being garbage, you should just stop being offended by that, right? But like somehow my offense to you just simply asking to be called how you want to be called, right, is offensive, right? Like, right. It's this centering of how we view the world, right, around them, right, around my comfort, my sense of who I am and what the world should look how I want it to look, right, and us centering our value system around that, right, which is why it makes them so angry when someone says, call me they, because it decenters our conversations about them, right, from them. And so doing this, right, is really refocusing, right, on what matters, who's human being, who, and unfortunately, the desire to be accepted by these folks because they're powerful, because they're the image of power and success, right? A lot of folks in our community want that approval, right? They want to be validated by people in power. Right. And so, unfortunately, there's a lot of folks in our community, right, who have grown up their whole lives with the goal that if you satisfy these folks, you're going to get the promotion, you're going to get the job, you're going to get wealth, right? And so a lot of these folks have just been conditioned to satisfy these folks. And eventually, right, you spend so much time integrating their value system into what you want to be, right? You tend to start to resent yourself, right? Because you believe that so much, right? That you tend to like be resentful of who you are, right? And so even for those folks who have gotten to that place, right, are totally unaffected by Donald Trump saying, or anybody in the campaign saying, Puerto Rico's garbage, right? Like, you have to already have listened to that many, many times, right? to achieve whatever status you think you've achieved by getting their approval, right? So like you've already heard Puerto Rico's garbage dump many times, right? To get to a place where these are the people who you want approval from. So, asking someone who wants to vote for Donald Trump and then saying, oh, what do you think now? It's like, I agree. They've been conditioned their whole, for years, for their whole lives, many times, right, to accept that Puerto Rico is a garbage dump, right? So like, this does not change their opinions, right? Like, it might bring attention. It brings attention to it. Obviously, there's a lot of independent voters, like say in central Pennsylvania, where this might be the final straw. I think there's also a lot of folks who have spent a lot of time, especially like in central Pennsylvania, talking to their neighbors who are on the fence, right? Because they want to be accepted, right? So they don't say they're against Trump, or they might be legitimately thinking about it, right? And maybe this might have an influence on them, So it helps with mobilization. It gives people an opportunity to use that to mobilize, just like Trump is using this as an opportunity to mobilize his base. Like making sure that the folks who say they're going to vote, right? I text my kids every day who are 19 and
one's a student here.
Well, one's 19 and one's 20. She turns 21. I literally text them every day. And I said, have you turned in your ballot? No. Right? No. Right. And so it's like, maybe I can help with that, right? Where you have, young folks or, folks who are kind of like, and, negative campaigns tend to like turn people off as well, right? We're like,
and thank you so much for answering that question. And to tie it back into Arizona. I think that's something anyone here who's dealing with the election is, hears 50 times a day is 10,000 votes. And I think what people want to know with these polls that are coming out is any candidate getting closer to winning over these votes? And did you uncover anything like that?
I think that no. I mean, I think the survey, it plays a small part. It really, I think, it gives us a snapshot in time that hopefully we can take another snapshot after the election, right? And then we can make some comparisons and see, because the poll was in the field before Biden had made the apology, right? And so no one was aware of it until Friday. I think it became news, Wednesday or Thursday. We were largely out of the field by then. And so we have this opportunity of sort of a little experiment to see, number one, did it matter, right? But I think also important is number two is, how did the word get out? How did this communication from Gila to Flagstaff happen, right? What are the capillaries out there in which information travels through this community?
And with the appointed elected representatives that we have now, Deb Haaland, history making, Jonathan Nez running in our own district, could be history making, Ruben Gallego. We're starting to see representatives who look a little bit more like America. But will this be helpful in mobilizing voters from these demographics that are usually neglected?
Yeah, and one of the questions we asked in the survey was does knowing that Jonathan Nez, who might be the first Native American Congress representative from Arizona, does that make you want to vote more? Does it make you like the Democratic Party more, right? And we see these are lessons from the Latino community and from the African American community, right? Is we know that having people with your experiences running for office makes you want to vote, right? And our question, one of the questions we had in the survey was like, even if you're in Tucson, and maybe you say you want to vote, but like, does this make you like the Democratic Party more? And I think that's a good lesson for both parties, right? That having people running for office that you support, that if you're going to support people, you should reach into those communities, and having folks within the community running for office will help you win. Elections, right? So I think that was one of the questions that we asked in the survey that we hope can contribute to these lessons for the Democratic Party, right? It's like, hey, Jonathan Nez running for office actually is going to help you win, right? Because you're only 10,000 votes, difference. Jonathan Nez was the former, president of Navajo Nation, and his ability to reach into that community is better than any other person, right? And if that helps, and the relationship that Jonathan Nez has with these institutions and having power, right? If the benefit, right, for the Democrats is like, oh, we now win more elections, right? That's going to encourage more investment, right, into these communities. It's going to hold the system more accountable, because now with folks in power, just like Padilla and even Katie Hobbs and Gallego, right, is like being able to hold them accountable, was that when they campaign and say they're going to do something, and they get into power, and they don't do it, there's now the ability to say, well, you're no longer going to represent us. And that was a very big lesson for Kristen Sinema and for anybody who wants to run after her in this state.
Right. I know you have something soon, so thank you so much. And that ends this episode of The Citizen, a special on-site here at SBS Castro. And thank you so much.
Thanks. Appreciate it.